Hi, welcome to Listen Up with me, David Bellamy from Harkn. This is a series of conversations with people that I come across in my work, all about the workplace. So subtitle for us, Voices from the Modern Workplace. Today, I'm joined by Geoff Marlow, somebody I met a couple of years ago on one of those group conversations, right? Drinking dialogues, dialogical drinks, indeed. Whatever they're called.
I still call it drinking dialogues because I think it's the dialogue that matters. Oscar calls it dialogic drinks because he likes to get alliteration. So
well, perfect. But that's a particularly powerful series of conversations with Oscar and Richard Claydon that we met, and I think I got drawn to you, and then your Substack, which I'm sure we'll talk about later on. Because of the way you see some of the things that we think a lot about here, some of the stuff that we do, like sense making, how the role that plays at work, your views on culture, organisation culture, how organisations think about it, perhaps how they should think about it. And I've come to value your thoughts and wisdom, and I use that word deliberately, greatly. And so it's brilliant to have you. This is the first of our episodes, as I said before. So I'm going to take us through, well, it's a conversation, Mike, but it'll be maybe a bit interviewee at times because I want to get your voice, not my voice, in the right order.
Yeah.
So best place to start with all these things is, I've done a bit of an intro about it. It'd be much better to hear your version of that. So what's your story? What gets you, not in the room here with me today, but what gets you to where you are today?
Yeah. Well, I guess, depends how far back you want to go, but I mean, I've always been fascinated with how things work and how they could be made to work better. That's always been a really central part of me. So as a kid, I would be taking apart things around the house and usually not being able to put them back together and getting a clip round the ear from my dad for not being able to put them back together. And maybe the reason I studied engineering, which is the direction I went in, was so that I got less clips around the ear because I figured if I could put stuff back together again, I'd be in less trouble. So I was fascinated with particularly electronics. And so I think I was about 14. My parents bought me a Philips electronics engineer kit for Christmas where you could build little circuits and you could make them do things. And I was fascinated with how something inanimate like a piece of technology, you could design it to do certain things, almost like do your bidding. And I think that then influenced the subjects I studied. So at A-levels, I did pure maths, applied maths and physics, and then went on to study engineering at university, electronics. And I got kind of interested more in control theory and control systems rather than other forms of electronics. Yeah. And I suppose that was where I really got my sort of grounding in systems thinking and the idea of understanding things systemically and how feedback works. And that then led to pretty much the career that I've been, the career path I've been following for the last 35 years or so around organisation culture and how do you create cultures of innovation, agility, adaptiveness.
Yeah, brilliant. And so let's talk about that then. So, because one of the things I picked up along the way in our conversations was you've worked with some, sort of downplaying your own role in this, but you often talk about people you work with and some of the organisations you work with and stuff. To talk a little bit about that, so that career aspect.
Yeah, well, I did my degree. It was a sandwich degree, so I did it over a 4-year period. So it's sandwiched with work experience, which was at British Aerospace. In fact, when I started, it was Hawker Siddeley. It became British Aerospace when I was doing that. So my degree was from 1976 to 1980. So I had quite a lot of exposure to the aerospace industry. Yeah. People sometimes say it isn't rocket science. Well, that was rocket science. And then a friend of mine who I'd studied with, I'd actually been to school with him as well. He was into radio. He had a radio amateurs thing in his loft room, and that kind of never really interested me that much. But he was working at the BBC, and he said, look, the BBC's about to digitise everything. So this was like about 1982. Why don't you come and join us? Because he knew I was a kind of digital guy, and the BBC was full of analogue guys. So I get the job, and in the 3-month period between working out my notice period at British Aerospace and turning up at the BBC, the BBC have kindly deferred their investment by 2 years in all this digital technology. So I'm now very much a digital guy in a still very analog world.
Yeah.
So that didn't kind of work out. And I spent about 9 months trying different things in the Beeb, but it really wasn't a good fit. And then my sister, who was a physics teacher at the time, saw an advert at the back of New Scientist for a company called Cambridge Consultants, which is a technology development company, not just IT, but obviously I did digital stuff, but they'd have people doing biotech and physics and laser optics and whatever. So using technology to help businesses create new products and services. And so I applied and I got a job there. And that really started me down the path where, because I'd got the electronics background, I could do the technology. And after a few years, I got to manage some projects and run a group of people. And I started to notice that I was sort of losing interest in the technology per se, because technology behaves the same way. You know, you do something with it one day, you do the same thing with it the next day, it behaves the same way. But you have people on your project team and you treat them the same way on 2 different days, or you treat 2 different people the same way and you get different responses. And I'm like, this is interesting. Yeah. What's all that about? And our clients often commented, because, you know, we got hired quite often when a new competitor or a competitor or a new entrant had brought out a new product or a new service that they hadn't seen coming, and they were losing market share. So they were like panicking, and we need to get a response on the market quickly. We don't do anything quickly. Yeah. You know, we've got all these rigid processes. It takes us 2 years to launch a new product, and we need something on the market in 9 months. So that would be a typical ask. And so what we would do at Cambridge Consultants is we didn't not only help them with the technology, but it was also like, how do you get your people to line up and work together more effectively across boundaries and across silos? And, you know, marketing hate R&D and R&D hate manufacturing, and manufacturing hates sales, and everybody hates management. How do you kind of do something to join that up so that you can get the thing out on the market quickly? And I thought, that's really, really interesting stuff. And then a client said one day, you know what, Geoff? He said, we like working with your people. In fact, we like working with your people a lot more than working with our people. You couldn't come and make our people behave more like your people, could you? And so that was the opening, because they were a long-standing client of ours. They knew what the fees were, and so they hired me before for other things. So that was how I got my start, and it was just an ask, and will you come in and see what you can do? And so one of the things that I learned from that, I kind of learned it by accident, was if you get asked to go in and kind of help out, you can go in and talk to people, and it's very low key and it's under the radar, and you can kind of help people find out how to make shifts happen. And I didn't realise till a lot later that a lot of change programs, people go in with, you know, lots of fanfare and, you know, we're going to do the amazing XYZ process, blah, 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 blah. And immediately everyone in an organisation is sort of, oh, hang on, this is threatening, and all the defensive shields go up. So I kind of accidentally got involved in culture change when clients wanted cultures of innovation, but I also accidentally discovered that the worst thing you can possibly do when you want to bring about major culture change in an organisation is announce to everybody that you want to bring about major culture change in the organisation.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely one of those things, isn't it, that you will see all the time now, isn't it? We were forever asked for routines. What's the way to launch Harkn? What's the way to do? How do you get people, or how do you get people on board with what you're doing? And I think that the sort of the cookie cutter mindset, there are steps you can take on there, but it's different everywhere. And I think that's the wonderful thing about organizations, that there's something unique about them. There's this sort of unique blend of company, time, market, and geography, all that stuff, and the people that are there that make it particularly interesting to do. So how do you, because what you've just described then is every big consultancy that's ever existed. So I've done something once, it worked really well, so now I'm going to put that in a box and sell it to the next person. Right. So where did you go from there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the big consultancy thing is an interesting question. I mean, if you want to go look at that direction just briefly. Yeah. Because if you think about how these firms were set up and when they were set up and what they got to do, and I mean, like the big brand name is McKinsey, of course, they were founded in 1926, so they're nearly 100 years old. Yep. And back in the day, most senior executives in organisations didn't have in-house capabilities around market analysis and understanding where technologies were going. And, so having people that you could call upon to give you a bit of a forward-looking view as to how things are developing, how things are changing, help you with advice about what you should think about doing, should you acquire a certain company or should you get into a certain market, all those kind of things, was a really useful service for organisations to have these brains on tap with a lot of experience and understanding of those kind of things, and the ability to go through complex analysis of multifaceted questions and challenges and come up with some suggestions, some proposals about where you should focus. So it was really high value. But maybe around 30 years ago, organisations started to realise that they needed not just advice, they also needed help in changing their culture to become more innovative, more agile, more adaptive. And of course, they turn to the people that they turn to normally for their advice, quite understandably. And those people being asked to do something, quite understandably offered something. But the thing about big consultancies is the fundamental way in which they operate. And in the industry, it's known as the finders, minders, grinders model. So senior people are finders. They go out and find clients. They keep the pipeline filled with work. There's a few mid-ranking people who look after projects. They're the minders. And then there's a hell of a lot of junior people who work all the hours God sends and then more, doing the legwork, and they're the grinders. And so the whole business model is dependent upon a few very senior people selling very large assignments that mobilise large numbers of junior people. And if you don't mobilise a large enough number of junior people for long enough, you very quickly bleed red ink. And so the whole game is, how can you mobilise the maximum number of junior people in order to keep the business profitable? And of course, these are junior people who are extremely bright, but very inexperienced. And so what you need is a standardised way of deploying them that has got all the risk taken out of it, that is a bit cookie cutter, a little bit handle turning. So that there isn't this massive risk of you deploying 50 or 100 consultants into a client organisation and them all running amok, and then somebody senior having to try and make the mess go away and turn it into something more coherent. So that's why they have these standardised processes that they like to call best practice, which, they're the best practice for mobilising large numbers of junior consultants at relatively low risk and high profit. I mean, because that's the game that they're in. So that was the model that, and that is the model that all big consultancies operate. And the problem there is that, as you said earlier, every organisation is unique. And if you're going to do the same thing, I mean, the big irony, of course, is we have the world's best practices around innovation. So just follow our standardised one-size-fits-all how to be the most innovative company. And you can already see the ridiculous irony in the idea of follow the same process and you'll become innovative. So it is something that I saw a lot, because a lot of the clients that would hire me when I was either working for a consultancy firm or as an independent, as I've been for the last 20 odd years, they don't come to me first. They use these big firms because they're low risk. What happens is they then find that it doesn't give them what they're looking for. So then they start looking further afield, and then they start to find people who are, more able to just bring that kind of grey-haired experience to help them within the organisation solve their own problems, and build the muscles that they need. Because culture change is a little bit like, I often use the phrase future fit. It's like getting fit, and that means the only people who get fit are the people who do the heavy lifting. You bring in an external consulting firm, lots of junior consultants come in, they do the heavy lifting. Any muscles that get developed are in the consulting firm, not in your own organisation. So it's something that's really challenging, because senior people want the security, if you like, of hiring a big name that the board will nod and say, oh, well, you've got them, that's good. But at the same time, usually they discover that it doesn't quite give us what we need, because it's not really developing our own people internally.
No, and I think that's there's so many things you said in there that we could branch off and talk about. I think I remember years ago, working with a former McKinsey partner. And he said, the reason that our projects never really work is that we've got an army of people that we pay a huge amount of money who come out of the best business schools and all that sort of stuff, and they don't look like any organisation that they work with. And yet their frame of reference is that we're going to come in and we're self-started, highly paid, motivated to do a great job, and all that sort of stuff. And that's the work we do. We leave that behind and then leave with a bunch of people who are motivated by different things, which is probably going to be to do great work and all that sort of stuff, but just from a different start point, with a different set of constraints. I always thought that was a really interesting observation. We could spend a lot of time, I guess, talking about some of these things. And let's come back to the big consultancy McKinsey thing for a minute, or come back in a minute. Sorry, not for a minute. Let's come. But you went on, didn't you, after that bit? Because I took us off on a tangent. But you worked with Peter Senge. Is that was his name correctly? Yeah. Tell me about that bit, because again, it's somebody I've read and find interesting.
Well, so Senge is best known for the organisational learning movement, or the learning organisation. He wrote a book in 1990 called The Fifth Discipline, which was regarded as one of the 75, one of the best, Harvard Business Review said it was one of the seminal management works of the previous 75 years. And so I'd read the book and I was, fascinated. And the link, of course, is the fifth discipline. There are 5 disciplines, the fifth one of which is systems thinking. And that was something that I was doing because of my, background in systems engineering. So I was kind of always intrigued by that. And then by almost coincidence, really, the Cambridge consultants who I mentioned earlier, I was working with them and I was moving more into this, how do you create cultures of innovation? And I was working with some colleagues from the parent company, which was a management consulting firm called Arthur D. Little. Yeah. But what I was doing was a bit odd. They had a technology and innovation management practice, which was mostly about helping clients with their technology strategy. So if you were Philips, Philips was a big client in those days. If you were Philips and you were doing, you remember CD players? We've all got MP3 now. But
I am old enough to remember CD players.
Yeah, so you'd have the CD Walkman and it'd be like, well, it's got a laser diode in to read the disc. Well, if you're Philips, what do you do about laser technology? Do you build an in-house lab? Do you partner with the university? Do you partner with a commercial partner? And if so, with what arrangement? Because you don't want to have them on your critical path and then they can ramp up the price. And so there was all these issues of how do you get the technologies that you need? Yeah. So a lot of the consultants in the practice used to do that kind of work, and how do you optimize your product development processes? But the guy who ran the practice, one of a Belgian guy called Jean-Philippe Deschamps, he knew that we'd got some really good technologists at Cambridge Consultants. So he would come and bring our people in occasionally on consulting assignments where the client was very skeptical. Technical people are very skeptical about management consultants, drive BMWs, wave their arms around and, give a good line in bullshit. And that's kind of, the added value. So he would bring in some of our technical experts who were usually really leading edge. And so that would convince some of the skeptics inside the client organisation that we really had something worth offering, bring this knowledge. But he also knew what I was doing, and I was up to this, how do you do the softer side of innovation? How do you get culture change? So he used to bring me in and I used to get involved in those assignments. But I was a bit of an outlier. There was only me and probably one other person in the 2,500 strong firm that were doing that kind of work. And then by a weird set of happenstance, I guess, in 1995, Peter Senge's consulting firm, Innovation Associates, was looking to partner with, or to actually get acquired by, a larger consulting firm, because they were about 40 or 50 people, and they were very local in the States. They've got clients mostly they're based in the Boston area, so they'd all come out of MIT, which is where Senge was. So they've got clients there, they've got clients on the Pacific Coast, California, but almost nothing else in the rest of the States, and hardly anything overseas. Or 1 or 2 companies overseas had hired them, some of the oil companies, BP, but they wanted to get a more global reach. So they looked around at which consulting firm could we get to acquire us that won't actually destroy us. Yeah. And they found Arthur D. Little, which was quite a weird organisation because there were bits of it that wanted to be like the finders, minders, grinders model, modelled themselves on McKinsey or
Yeah.
Boston Consulting. Boston Consulting was actually founded by an ex-ADL guy called Bruce Henderson, who saw that ADL wasn't particularly market focused. And I remember being there when the CEO said, a lot of people think of Arthur D. Little as a consulting firm with 2,500 people. When you're CEO, you realise it's 2,500 consulting firms of one person each, because everybody liked to do their own thing, Yeah. So the Innovation Associates, Sengi and his colleagues thought, this looks like a fairly safe firm for us to get acquired by, because they haven't got such a strong culture that they're going to kill what we do. So all of a sudden, these sort of 30, 40, 50 learning organisation, world-class learning organisation consultants were suddenly part of ADL. And I was there as well doing what they were doing, but it's suddenly become mainstream for ADL because this was the major acquisition that the CEO had arranged. So it was fabulous, So I kind of got to work with all the guys. Sengi himself didn't join because he was an academic and he wanted to stay at MIT. But the other guys, so Charlie Kiefer and Joel Yanovitz, who set up the consulting firm with him, they both became partners in ADL. And we had a great fun for about 5 or 6 years doing all that stuff with ADL's clients around the world. So that was how I got exposed initially to that work and went up the learning curve with some of the guys who did that work. And then later on, I got involved in the Society for Organisational Learning, which was the thing that Sengi was sort of behind, that span out of MIT's Organisational Learning Centre.
And if you were describing, I'm sort of sitting here thinking about the sort of learning organisation and some of the stuff that goes with that. If you were describing that to somebody watching this conversation or listening to this conversation that didn't know it, how would you sum it up? How would you describe it?
Well, I think the person who probably articulated it best was a Dutch guy by the name of Arie de Geus. And Arie was the head of group planning at Shell, the oil company. He was spent the whole of his career at Shell. His father had spent the whole of his career at Shell as well. So he was kind of, really a Shell guy. And they began to realise that with the oil crisis of 1973, 50 years ago now, where oil prices went up by a factor of 4, and like they had been stable for generations, and then all of a sudden there was the oil crisis as the Arabs decided that, hey, if we turn the tap off, people will pay more money. So, there was this big oil crisis. And so Shell realised, all of our strategic planning machinery is predicated on stability and things only changing incrementally. What do we do when there's big disruptions, when things become very uncertain and unpredictable? How do we respond to that? And so initially they came out with the idea of scenario planning, which was there are certain things that are kind of fixed. There's certain demographics, for example, that populations are growing at a certain rate. So you kind of know, well, if there's that many 15-year-olds now, in 10 years' time, there's going to be about this many 25-year-olds because the maths just goes that way. But then there are other factors like changing in technology, changes in social values, et cetera, that, are not so predictable. So if you kind of take out the fixed bit and then you work out what you think the variation of the variable bits is, you can come up with a set of scenarios that give you a little bit more freedom to explore different possibilities that might unfold. And then you can build your strategy around that. And so Arie used to describe this. So they would come and do their scenarios, and the committee of managing directors, which was the Shell top management team, would come together for some jamboree every year, and they'd be presented with the scenarios, and they're great, fine, everything. They'd all nod and whatever. And then he said in the evening, you could guarantee that what would happen is you go to the bar, and one of the managing directors would sidle up to you and say, "Really good job, Arie. Really like the scenarios, but just tell me, which one do you think's actually going to happen?" Right? Because they were realizing that, because they wanted to have the one scenario so that they could plan based on that one scenario. So the idea that an organization can plan for a certain future is deeply, deeply there in the DNA of organizational thinking and has been for like 100 years. But in a world that's increasingly uncertain and unpredictable, you can't do that. What you need is an organization that can learn quickly. And as Arie said, the only sustainable competitive advantage is to learn faster than your competitors. So this was the idea, is that you've got to be able to sense what's going on in the world. You've got to be able to make some decisions about what to do. You've got to take some action. And then based on that action, you've then got to sense what's going on in the world. and you've got to make some decisions and take some action. So that kind of loop of sense-making, decision-making, action-taking, embedding that in the DNA of your organisation, so that's the culture, that's the way we do things around here, is what creates a learning organisation.
Terrific. That's a brilliant answer. And the reason I wanted you to explain that, and I'm bloody glad you explained it the way you did as well, was because, of course, you couldn't think of a better example that feels more current, right? And I think that's the way, because it's the same thinking that makes us think about agile. That so there's lots of different versions of this stuff that sit around. It's about being, well, taking stock, isn't it? Constantly taking stock and adjusting, micro adjustments.
Yeah.
And doing things differently and getting your whole organisation to think in that way. And that was what I found most interesting about the fifth discipline. Just because, as a book, that sort of learning organisation, you're in the world that we're in, and of course, like yours, my consulting journey, it's slightly different. But mine came about from actually I was the finder. It was what I was good at, and so I was the guy that would go out and. Didn't have the seniority, but I was pretty good at the relationship building stuff, and what you realise after that just meant I spent a lot of time with the senior clients, if you like, and the people who were making the decisions about the work that we were doing, and it takes you longer than you think, but you soon realise that it is all about the people, because that's what makes it different everywhere you go, and we'd always have people in the back pocket. So this is not a Harkn thing, this is in my previous career, right? But you bring in a culture change guy. There's 150 people working on a project, and there's a bloke you bring in for a fortnight to do some work around that. And that was the sort of mindset, I think. And it's just very interesting to me now that it's absolutely mainstream, isn't it? But it's taken a long time. I'm going to just take a break from that direction for a minute.
Sure.
Just straight into some stuff I want to talk about with you in more detail, because I want to do that justice. Brilliant beginning to this conversation, but I want to change direction for a second and do something that I'm going to try and do in all of the conversations, and it's something I'm personally interested in, right? Which is something I'm sort of titling Then and Now, and it's something I've done with senior people that I've worked with over the years. Just really contrast for me, or talk to me about what work was like when you started. If you cast your mind back to when you were starting in...
When the dinosaurs were roaming the earth.
Yeah, exactly right. Before the oil crisis, right? Well, you take us back to that. And then, so what was it like? How was it for young people? How was it for young people starting at work back then? And then perhaps, how you think that's changed, your perspective on how that's changed today.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the biggest change is that for a lot of people, and this is particularly true of people going into larger organisations, there was a kind of expectation that you'd get recruited at quite a young age. And the idea was, and this sounds so alien today, the idea was you'd have a job for life. The company there'd be almost like a marriage between you and the company's deal would be, we will develop you and groom you, guide you in your career. We'll help you develop in the direction that you want to go in. We'll support you, we'll educate you, we'll give you different career positions in order to follow the path that you'd like to follow. And then after doing that for 40 years or so, you'll have a nice final salary pension, so you'll have quite a comfortable retirement. And that was safe. I mentioned Harry de Geus worked at Shell all his life as his father had. That was the deal there. My wife's father worked at Rolls-Royce all his life. Yeah. That was the deal there. And I guess when I sort of started at the BBC, I wasn't quite so aware at British Aerospace, because I was only 17 when I started there, and I chose the place because I wanted to do a sandwich degree. I didn't want to do just study and then, I knew I wanted to do engineering, but I didn't want to just study it academically. I wanted to actually get dirt under my fingernails, which I already did because I played around. When other people were reading Tolstoy and Tolkien and stuff, I was reading car manuals. I'd buy the Haynes manual for cars that I would never, ever own and try and understand, how does a Ferrari Berlinetta box's gearbox
not
work?
The Ford Escort Mark II.
No, well, I didn't have an Escort. I had a Ford Cortina at one point. No, I had a Mark II Cortina, the one with the cross-flow, 1600 GT.
Terrific.
Quite a nice car, actually. regretted getting rid of that.
Lots of people. I'm hoping if we have anybody watching this interview that we go into the internet and go, what was one of those?
Yeah. Sorry, I've sidetracked us onto cars now. What was the question?
We were talking about then and now, and you were talking about, so it was a bit like a job for life.
Yeah, so
when you joined the BBC.
Yeah, so when I joined the BBC, I was there, like I say, for only about 9 months, and because it was still analog and I was digital, and I knew that wasn't what I wanted to do. But I do remember this. I came across a guy who was, so I was connected with, my office was near Broadcasting House in London. And this guy had been with the BBC 20 years. He was an engineer, but he was based at BBC Bristol. And his wife and him had got a nice house just outside on the outskirts of Bristol, and she'd got her social circle of friends. And as was in the BBC contract, you could be positioned somewhere else in the BBC empire at almost like at a whim. And they decided that they weren't going to have an engineering function in Bristol anymore. So his job was relocated to London. Yeah. And after 20 years service, he's locked into the pension scheme. He's still got to do another 20 years until he retires. And so he's either got to commute in from Bristol to London every day, or what he actually chose to do is come up on a Sunday night and live in really grotty digs all week because he had to pay for it out of his pocket because his wife didn't want to move anywhere near London because she'd got her. So I sort of saw that there was this danger associated with being part of an organisation and locked into it. But it was the deal. The deal was that you work for an organisation, and in that case, they arguably weren't delivering on their side of the deal, which was, we'll provide you with the kind of career you want. But the BBC was always an odd organisation because it's sort of independent, but it's government funded, so it also has to do what it thinks will get its funding approved next time. And so you see, it's a very, very strange organisation in that respect.
When you think about decision making, so I want to stay with then for a minute before we come and talk about what any obvious differences. So obviously you've alluded to the contractual one and the commitment side of the relationship between employees and employer. Yeah. What about those? When you sense making, we've touched on that before, and decision making. How do you recall those things happening when you were starting out? Yeah, well, I guess the thing is that it was all happening a lot slower, because the world was more predictable. You could plan 5 years out. Everybody put together a strategic plan that was a rolling 5-year thing, and you revisited it every year, but you probably only made minor tweaks to it. So the world was sufficiently stable for you to do that. And so a lot of the sense making was done on a very slow cycle, and you could hire consulting firms to go out and analyse all sorts of things and come up with recommendations, and you build them into your strategic plan, and then turn them into operational plans. And a lot of that could be done at the top of the organisation. Yeah. So the strategy and the decision, so the sense making and the decision making could be done at the top, and then you hand off the action taking to people in the body of the organisation, the hands, the front line, the coalface, all of those euphemisms for the people on the ground. And because of my background, a lot of the organisations I ended up working with were in the high-tech sector. And they were always a bit different because you have to keep up with the latest tech. It's no good you having the best valves if everybody else is using semiconductors. It's no good you having the best transistors if everybody's using integrated circuits. It's no good you having the best integrated circuits if everyone's using programmable device integrated circuits. So it's like the technology is always moving on. And one of the things that's peculiar about the high-tech industries, and always has been, is the people who understand the tech are usually the young people, because they've grown up with it, they've studied at university, so they're coming into organisations at a relatively junior level, but they're bringing in the leading edge sense making. And so the cultures in those organisations have always been a little bit different to the traditional top-down command and control, where it was assumed that the more senior you were, the more experience you'd got, understandably, therefore the better your sense making was, therefore you should be making sense and making decisions, and then everybody else should be doing pretty much what they're told to do. And if you go back to Frederick Winslow Taylor and scientific management, which was 1911, the idea that a worker would actually get involved in making decisions about what was the best thing to do was completely anathema. It was like, you just don't do that. The job of the senior people was to make the decisions, and the job of the junior people was to do what they were told to do. Yeah.
And it was really only in the 1980s that people started to question some of that thinking, largely because Japan had come back from having been defeated in World War II to suddenly becoming the world's second largest economy. And they were doing it because they'd got all the workforce who were working on new products and working on production, continuously improving what they were doing. You know, the whole quality movement and ISO 9000 and total quality management, which was really big in the 80s and 90s, came about because you realised that actually the best people to come up with improvements to processes and products are often the people who are making them, because they're dealing day in, day out with something that they can see isn't working, that somebody more senior decided. And often they just do workarounds or whatever. But if you deliberately create the culture where the people who are doing the work get to sense make and involved in the decision making about how to improve things, then you actually get improvement built into the processes. And these Japanese companies were wiping the floor with, North US companies. The whole of the television industry got eaten up. A lot of other white goods and cars, automotive, all of these things that were coming out of Japan were just so much higher quality at equivalent or lower cost. So people were sort of waking up to the fact that this was a little bit different.
And these are the processes today that, because you talked about total quality management, Lean Six Sigma was one of those that came out of, am I right in thinking that was one of the, after when Kanban, as we often refer to it now, which is quite agile related, isn't it?
Yeah, so I mean, the Toyota production system was the big thing that everybody kind of got excited about, which really had all of this total quality thinking in there. And of course, ironically, it was imported into Japan by people like Deming, Duran, Schuhart, who were American statisticians and academics working on the theory of these things, and they were getting no audience whatsoever in the States. So, Japan still awards the Deming Prize every year for quality improvement. And so they it was only when the Japanese started to eat the Americans' breakfast, lunch and dinner that oh my God, there needs to be something in here. And then we're into, again, the whole cycle of consulting, and McKinsey's inventing the 7S model and culture being shared values and all of the stuff that came out.
We're going to come to talk about that in a minute. Before we do that, though, so because I'm sitting here listening to you and I can tell, right, so I'm hearing the difference between today and yesterday, although there's a lot of similarities. But if you think about, so if you imagine, it's very hard to do this, I know, but if you imagine starting your career today, how do you imagine, you consult with organizations, you work with leaders all the time now.
Yeah.
Do you ever get a sense from them, or do you sense yourself while you're there what it would be like for a young person joining the workforce right now?
I probably get my best sense of that from my son. He's now in his mid-30s, but, seeing the path he went through. So he did a degree in architecture, thinking he wanted to be an architect because he liked the idea of design for human experience.
Yeah.
And of course, because of technology, the whole nature of the architecture profession has changed hugely. The joke used to be that junior architects spent their first few years designing car parks and toilet blocks, because they'd be handed off by the senior architects would give the grunt work to the juniors. And now it's all done by computer. You just kind of say, there's the layout, and you click a button and say, give me 10 different car park designs. Click, click, click. Oh, I quite like that one. Click, 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 click. Yeah, I like number 3 best. Right, we'll have number 3 with a few variations, all done by software. So what he began to realize when he was doing his degree was, this career is not what I thought it was going to be. I'm not going to get to design for human experience. Actually, what junior architects seem to spend their time doing now is battling local planning authorities to get things put through that can actually then be built. So he ended up looking around to see, well, what could I do that is still designed for human experience? So he'd got this curious combination of an A in maths and an A in art. And he ended up, again, through kind of happenstance. It was his girlfriend's boss's husband was a senior director in one of the visual effects companies. And it was something he'd been thinking about doing. And so he ended up having a chat with this guy, and then one thing led to another. And so he's now in his 8th year or so, working for visual effects companies on, movie visual effects and that kind of thing. So if you've ever seen Altered Carbon on Netflix, he did all the thrusters on all of the spacecraft. That's his claim to fame.
I don't know if I have seen that, but and how does he describe work to you? So how's it? So obviously he's frustrated with technology taking a chunk of what he was hoping to do in his life, right? And then he's embraced it in a different way. The
key thing I think is the unpredictability. It's like when I went for careers guidance, it'd be like, oh well, you're good at problem solving and you're good at maths, do engineering. Nowadays, it's like, well, what would you do if you were, it's like there would have been no careers advisor at Alex's school saying to him, have you thought of visual effects? Just wasn't on their radar. And a lot of stuff around social media and the kind of stuff we're doing here, the kind of tech that we're using here, because that's really changing the world so rapidly and in such unpredictable ways. When people start to piece these things together, someone like Steve Jobs at Apple sort of comes up with a solution to Napster and says, well, hang on a second, how about if I do a deal with all of the record companies to provide a platform that allows them to sell their music, and then it's all hosted on Apple's ecosystem. Somebody comes along and does that, and it changes the whole nature of the game. And so the industry around that changes. Well, that's happening all over the place. So I think for younger people today, it's very, very difficult to see what's the proven career path that I should go down in order to have a fulfilling career, because I might pick a particular direction and in 2 years' time, it doesn't exist anymore because it's been taken away by some technology-enabled thing. And there was a book by a guy called Dan Pink a few years ago, which was called A Whole New Mind. And he was making the case that actually anything that is relying upon technical skills, you can be disintermediated either by technology or by it being outsourced to online to places that are lower cost, like India or Korea or whatever. And so he was making the case that really what you need to do is to find out what it is that makes you, gives you the buzz, gives you enthusiasm, makes you energized. Steve Jobs said this in his Stanford commencement speech in 2005. You've got a lot of your life is going to be at work, and if you're going to be at work, the only thing that's going to satisfy you is to do great work, and the only way you're going to do great work is to do something that you love. And so that was something that I kind of picked up on, and with Alex we talked quite a lot about what was it that lights his fire and floats his boat, to see what the possibilities were. So I think that for younger people today, my strong advice, if I'd call it that, but my strong sort of steer would be really to try and do some of that inner work to discover what is it that you really love to do, that you would do for free, but can you find a way of getting paid for doing that as well? Because there are many, many more opportunities, but they're unpredictable. There's no pre-plotted career paths, and there's no kind of safe home that you could go and join to be guaranteed a career doing that. I mean, people thought there was with firms like Google, but you look at all the layoffs that happened this year, and Google's the place that's supposed to be all about psychological safety, and yet, there's some guy rocks up at 4 a.m. to finish something off urgently for a client, and his security pass doesn't work. That's how he finds out he's been let go. He can't actually get in the office to do some work to deliver something for a client. And
they are, well, there's countless stories, aren't there, of what it's like in tech right now. I mean, I tend not to think too far into the west coast of America, because I think they're a vastly different sort of tech industry than most others. But no, it's really interesting, isn't it? I think that's a whole piece around young people at work. Innovation's an interesting point in there, isn't it? Because you talk about the example that, well, almost the example, because whenever I talk about innovation, I say actually the thing that we get lost in is the iPod. Right? So everybody's looking to reinvent a market, reinvent an industry, and so we tend to treat innovation as Innovation Week, right? Come up with some groundbreaking ideas, and the reality of it, and I think this is one of the things I think has changed dramatically, is that innovation is about solving problems, real world problems, and every company is riddled with them. And all the little ones, the gritty bits that get in the way of I don't mean grit as in your perseverance, but I mean the grit as in your shoe that drives everybody slightly bonkers when you go there every day. All the workarounds that we find to do with stuff because we don't have the right kit or the right systems, we can't solve as well as we perhaps once might be able to. And I think so the systems of governance and control that sit in organizations become hugely limiting factors for employees, because what you end up with, I'm always drawn to the idea that, there's a moment for lots of people they can remember in their career where something happens. They've done something. It's almost like they notice their career path might have just changed a little bit, or they'll think back to something where somebody noticed they'd done something really different. And I just wonder how hard or easy it is for that to be achieved today, because we're so rules based. That's one of the big things, because you've got this constant change going on externally. Whether it's any quicker or not, who knows? We can have a long discussion about that in itself. But it feels like you go back to the oil crisis and suddenly the world changes and you start scenario planning. And I think about CEOs I've spoken to in the recent years who say, well, we do those big planning cycles still.
Yeah.
But every one of those feels like the Mike Tyson moment, isn't it? So we have a strategy, but it lasts until we get punched in the face by somebody else, right?
Or by COVID.
And that's a few minutes, it's a few months away, isn't it, often?
Yeah.
So that's, I think, is an interesting...
I mean, there's one thing I'd sort of, not quite push back on, but sort of broaden a little bit, which is, and I haven't quite worked this through fully in my own mind, because a lot of people will say, everything is about problem solving and, innovation is about problem solving. But I think actually so it's almost like, to be problem solving is, there's something happening that we don't want. How do we make what we don't want go away? Whereas I think there's a kind of okay, what could we do more? So there's like a kind of a value creation. And I think if we sort of understand value in a broader sense, like, what is it that we might do as an organization that creates value, that is perceived as value by the people who are receiving it? And I don't just mean monetary value. I mean things that people value in the world, because ultimately, the ability to generate revenue and to generate profit is about, if we are producing things, products or services that other people value, then they'll have a value, and that some of that can be converted into money. And I think it's quite important to understand that, because I think for me around innovation, like you take again Steve Jobs, and it's not a paragon of virtue, but in innovation is an interesting character, because he would say there's not a lot of point in asking customers what they want, because they won't know what they want until we show it to them. If you have the ability to produce something that people kind of want but they don't know they want, then you have real opportunity to move things forward. And often the people who will see those things and come up with the ideas of those things are not your senior strategists. They're not your most senior people. They're often people right in the body of the organisation who are maybe picking up customer calls or seeing issues with certain things and going, well, why couldn't we do that and that? And they go and mention it to somebody senior and they go, oh, no, that's a bit risky, and then so it gets killed. So they go off and start their own company and do it, and then make a fortune, and then sell the company back to the people who said that it was of no interest whatsoever.
Well, that could be. Well, listen, that's a fair broadening or exploration of what I was saying, and I think that you're right, of course, in the sense that there is absolutely a value creation sense in that. The thing I think I probably focus, and this will be about frame of reference, right? So I think often about, okay, we can recognize value in organizations very readily if it leads to revenue, right? If we are solving a problem for a customer that makes them buy more stuff, right? Or gets more through the system. The thing I don't think we recognize quite so often is that bit about work that relates to the people I'm sitting with every day, right? The things that stop me from being perhaps as productive, all the things that just downright get on my nerves all the time, right? There's lots of things that, and look, with a platform like Harkn, I have a wonderful window into organizations that we work with, which is kind of weird, because I sit and look.
Or a digital voyeur.
That's what I'm just gazing into organizations all the time and thinking, okay, that's really interesting. You watch what people are talking about here. And it always just takes me back to the countless conversations. And this is almost the stuff that led us to what we do. But it was those, when you go and talk to people about their organisation selling consulting services, I wish we were more innovative. I wish we were more responsive, a bit more proactive. I wish our people would do this more. And then, and I sit and look, still gazing through this digital window, and you see it all there in plain sight that people...
Why won't the senior people let us do this?
Yeah, well, it's some of it's just expressed as frustration. Why can't, I'm really fed up with this. And I'm thinking, okay, I wonder if... It's not that everything needs to be addressed, right? There's a difference, but it's all there to be seen. I wonder if anybody ever says, why don't we do something with that? I wonder who that person could be. So we got an e-book that's being written at the moment. It's just something because it's really fresh in my memory. So I started a preview. This is all about the value of listening, right? So it's a real-time employee voice. And we'd asked one of our clients to give an interview as part of the work for that. And what he described was, he said, the thing that we were worried about when we first started doing this real-time stuff was that you get this constant stream. And because the surveys, we'd done stuff by surveys before, that's how we'd listen, right? And suddenly you think, we accelerate that and listen all the time, then we're just going to be constantly struggling to keep up with the constant need to change the things that people want. And he said, and then we realised actually that's not the way to do it. It's not the way to listen. It's actually to be more responsive in the moment, and not everything needs to be a change program. Not everything needs proper change. But also then you say, well, why don't we try and work on the things that help our people to make the changes that they need to make for themselves?
Right.
So this is his quote, and it's in this book. So I've not heard him ever describe any of this to me, but I've just read it last week. And then it says, and so in many respects, what we've done by changing the way we listen is not only made us more responsive, not reactive as a leadership team, but it's made the entire business more responsive and less reactive. And I just think that's probably where I go with this sort of, because you can see it all there, and it's the hidden signs of, I guess, organisations not perhaps being a learning organisation. If we bring it back to the thing we talked about earlier, not doing Kanbans, any of those sorts of systems that are about observe, change. And I don't know, I almost sort of got myself into there a moment of sort of thinking actually freeze, measure, unfreeze, all that sort of stuff. But it's certainly, that's the stuff I think that's really interesting to see it work. And I just come back to the point about then and now. I don't know if young people have the freedom or feel the freedom. Organisations have got bigger, haven't they? Less loyal, so people are more nervous. Anyway, those are the sorts of things that...
Yeah. I mean, as I said, a lot of the companies that I've been poking around inside have been in the high-tech sector, so they do have a slightly different focus on these things. I guess senior people tend... I was saying earlier that the way in which things work when things were moving more slowly was senior people would see themselves as decision makers. And one of my little catchphrases is, senior people shouldn't be making decisions, they should be creating conditions. And this is what you're describing. It's, can you create the conditions for the people in the organisation to not only solve problems, but also look for opportunities to create value? And the change can be quite dramatic, even in contexts where it doesn't normally happen. There's a wonderful book written by a US submarine captain called Turn the Ship Around.
Yeah, love that story.
David Marquet. And he gets assigned to a different model of sub or different type of sub than the one he's used to. So he turns up with no technical competence to run the ship. And he's on the bridge, like with the first taking the sub out for trials or whatever. And he tells the midshipman, all ahead 2/3. And the midshipman, and the number two passes on the order, all ahead 2/3. And the midshipman's like, and the captain notices that the midshipman's looking a bit uncomfortable. He says, "Is there a problem?" And he says, "Yes, sir, on this type of boat, we don't have an ahead 2/3. It's like half or everything, that's all you get." So the captain turns to his number two and said, "Did you know that?" And he goes, "Yeah." He said, "Well, so why did you pass on the order?" And he said, "Well, you're the captain, you gave the orders."
It's an order.
So it's like, oh my God, we're all going to die. So he actually, rather than try and understand all the technology of the ship, he institutes this process where he encourages people to come to the bridge with, I intend to, This was the sort of language that he introduced. I intend to put the bow planes down 15 degrees. And then the captain would ask certain questions like, how much room do we have between us and the seafloor? How fast are we going? They kind of, is it safe effectively?
Yeah.
And if he's judged that it's safe, then it's kind of like Jean-Luc Picard. I said, actually, this seat makes me feel a bit like Jean-Luc Picard. It's like, make it so.
Yeah.
And so what would happen is people were thinking through what they would do if it was their command decision. And all the captain's doing is just testing to see whether or not they've thought things through and then encouraging them. And so the ship, the USS Santa Fe, goes from being the worst performing boat in the fleet to being the best performing boat in the fleet, and produces more staff officers because of the crew have learnt all this stuff. And the one line in the book that I always remember leapt out to me as though it was in 50-point font. He said, we had no need for a leadership development program, because the way we ran the boat was the leadership development program. And I think that's really something that most senior executives could learn from. It's kind of how we groom and develop our people should be on the job, in the work, by helping create the conditions for them to take more responsibility in a safe way so that they learn by doing, rather than being forced to follow loads of rigid procedures and then for a couple of weeks sending them off to London Business School or something to do some executive program and coming back and expecting them to change. And one of my friends talks about it's all very well taking people to the zoo, but then they have to go back into the jungle. And the way you deal with the animals in the jungle is very different to the way you deal with the animals in the zoo.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good analogy, yeah. The Marquette story is terrific, isn't it? I think it's... we talked about that in here the other week. Right, let's move on and talk about another thing I want to make recurring, because I'd like your perspective on this. Right, so we've talked a little bit about the past, we've talked a little bit about the present, but if there were three things, you don't have to stick to three, but if there were three things that matter most right now, so if you were the leader of an organisation, and I know that's a ridiculously broad question, but you can define how you answer it. Right, so you're a leader of an organisation of scale, because that's the ones that I think that's where the complex stuff is. What are the three things that matter most in the workplace right now?
Well, you've used one of my trigger words, which is
leadership.
Leader.
Yeah, okay.
Because I think there's far too much emphasis on leaders and not enough emphasis on leadership. And the reason I would say that is, again, back to quoting my good friend, my former colleague, Peter Senge, in his third book, The Dance of Change, which I think came out in 1999, he defines leadership in a way that I think is absolutely bang on the money. And I asked him, actually, where did he come up with it? And he just said it just seemed obvious. So it was an interesting thing.
Well, I know what you're about to say, so that makes sense to me. But right,
yeah. So he said leadership is the capacity of a human community to shape its future.
Yeah.
And if you then think about, well, if that's the case, if leadership is the capacity of a human community, an organisation, let's say, to shape its future, how much of that capacity do we unlock and unleash in the average organisation? And I would argue not very much. And part of the reason why it's not very much is because we actually tend to think of leadership in a very traditional way. Yeah. And I think the way in which that was most clearly articulated was John Cotter's book, Leading Change, which was 1996, I think.
Also on the shelf.
Also on the shelf, yeah. And he's got this 8-step model. So you create a guiding coalition, you come up with a vision, you get the troops enthused, you get them involved, whatever. And it's kind of, it never felt right to me because it jarred with that experience that I mentioned earlier of a client saying, can you come and make our people be more like your people? And not making some big song and dance announcement about it. And yet the traditional kind of view of what leadership is some senior folks in the corner office with big hats come up with an amazing vision that everybody's going to get super enthused about.
Build a vision, sell a vision, right?
And then, everybody's going to suddenly go, wow, I'd love to do it. And they really get enrolled and enthused. The reality is you put some massive, great thing up in front of people and they go, oh my God, what does this mean for my job?
Yeah.
Will I still have a job? And, how do I fit in here? Well, they're all very complex questions that you can't answer right at the beginning of some program where you've made this big announcement. And, it's nice for senior executives to stand up and grandstand and say, here's the vision I have for this company. but it usually triggers all sorts of concerns and fears and worries in people inside the organisation. So I think that once you kind of get the idea of if leadership is the capacity of the community to shape its future, how much of that capacity is currently online versus untapped? Where could you reduce some of the restrictions and the constraints that would allow more of that capacity to emerge? Then you're actually starting to unlock the capability of people in the organisation to be more innovative, be more adaptive, create value in new ways, because they feel that they get the opportunity to do that. And it has to be a journey, because you can't suddenly throw the switch and say, right, I want everybody to suddenly be very creative, because you get chaos. And people will say they want more responsibility, but actually, if they don't feel confident in taking it on, they'll say they want it, but they won't actually be able to enact it. And then senior people will look and say, well, we gave them the opportunity and they didn't step up to it, so clearly they're not up to it. So we should take the reins back.
Listen, I think, sorry, I'm talking over you there, but I think you're absolutely right. I mean, one thing, so I think so I've just used the expression build a vision, sell a vision, that, which obviously is, I guess, part of my experience and part of the stuff we even used to do. You do that work that is oriented at what's a 3-year plan. And I think it's important that we don't lose sight of the fact that people need clarity about where they're trying to go. And I think that sort of longer term, where some of the things like purpose makes a difference to me. And I don't really get too drawn into some of the hype around purpose, perhaps. But the idea of knowing why your organisation exists, and every leader should, if I go back and look at earlier incarnations of organisations, Quaker type organisations are very good at this. They had a stewardship mindset. Yeah. My job is to leave this thing in the better position than I got it, right? And in fact, I remember talking to a CEO friend of mine who took over at a very large mutual. And I just remember talking to him a bit before he became, a few years before he became the CEO. And I suspect this is why he is now the CEO. But he thought about a mutual. So I've got one guy in the organisation talking to me about, we're not ambitious enough. We don't want to change fast enough. It's quite slow. And this guy is saying to me, the thing about a mutual is we've been here for 150 years. I sort of see our job is to make sure we're here for our members in the next 150 years. And so when he's coaching me as a consultant almost, saying if these rapid curves that people try to create, change cycles, just flat them out a bit, right? And think longer term, think about stability and steadiness, which I know is difficult for organizations. You've got to be agile in that context, but I just quite like that sense. So that was just about the sort of, I guess, the build a vision, sell a vision. I think it's really important that we don't, I guess, necessarily throw out the ideas of all of those things. It's important that somebody at the top, I think, when mobilizing large groups of people to do stuff, there is still accountability that sits somewhere that people can have
I think people still have responsibility, but I would say that the thing that I think is really important, and I'm absolutely not a fan of the idea of flat organisations. I mean, I think they are, you never get them. I mean, there's a wonderful book there's a paper written by Jo Freeman, who was one of the leading lights of the feminist movement. This is like 50 odd years ago, 1970, she wrote this paper called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. And because they saw...
this was before corporate rebels existed, right?
This was before corporate rebels, probably while corporate rebels were still in their, well, they're probably, in their short trousers at school and stuff. They tried in the women's movement to not have hierarchy because they saw it as patriarchal. And what they discovered is when you try and get rid of hierarchy, you still get it. It's just that it's emergent. So nobody quite knows. People who are not in the in-group don't know what the hierarchy is. And certain people have power. They might get it accidentally, but they wield it and they may not even consciously wield it. So the people who are not in the power loop they have a feeling that somehow things are going on that they're not sure about and they're disenfranchised. So the point being that even if you try and eliminate hierarchy, with if I can be a bit naughty here, with sociocracy or holocracy or any other form of bolocracy.
Yeah.
You're busy trying to go against human nature because hierarchy will emerge. So the question then is, if you're going to get a hierarchy anyway, be mindful about the type of hierarchy you want. What do you want a hierarchy of? Because if my thesis would be, if you have a hierarchy of decision making, you'll slow everything down to a snail's pace. That's what we always used to do. Senior executives were decision makers. What you need now is you need a hierarchy of, the more senior you are, the more responsibility you carry for creating the conditions in which good decisions get made and implemented. And that means that you have to get these three things of sense-making, decision-making and action-taking tightly coupled, rapidly and repeatedly iterated, deeply embedded and widely distributed throughout the organisation. And that's very, very hard for people whose sense of self in the world and whose sense of self-value in the world is, I make the decisions. And very many senior people have that deep, deep sense that their job is to make decisions, whereas it really needs to shift to their job is to make sure good decisions get made and implemented.
Yep.
And it sounds like a subtle, almost sounds like a subtle bit of wordplay. Yeah. But if you've got to make the decisions, you become the decision-making bottleneck. You become stressed. Decisions get made because they have to be made, and then they're not made very well because you're not tapped into the sense-making, because you can't be, because you're too busy making all these decisions. And when you've made a decision and somebody questions it, you don't want to revisit it because you've got all these other decisions that you haven't yet made. You've already made that one. Leave me alone. Go away, right? Whereas if you see your job is creating the conditions in which good decisions get made and implemented, you don't have to make all the decisions. You're still going to have to be involved in all the critical decisions, absolutely. But the more that you can get other people involved in decision making in a way that allows the capacity of the organisation to make sense, make decisions, take action, that capacity to grow, then I would argue you are creating conditions for greater leadership, and therefore you're adding more value. You're kind of justifying the big bucks that you get paid as a senior executive. So I'm a bit finicky about the language. I tend not to call senior people leaders. I tend to call them senior executives, ensure that they know what leadership is and what their role is in creating the conditions for that to emerge, as David Marquet did in the submarine example.
And there's something naturally, really organic about the way this conversation is going, which is not quite the way I'd imagined it, maybe. But
it's emergent, David.
Well, it's emergent. Well, most of the best things are. But I think so two things. One is I guess I'd like your opinion. So I had a conversation with somebody very recently about not quite framing it the way you are, but linking all the way back to that big consultancy model where you say, we're stuck in a cycle. And I first observed this, I think, after the crash in the early 2000s, where we saw decision-making retreat to the boardroom. And then when we came out, and organisations got a little bit of flexibility again and a bit of freedom, you may now make decisions, but everybody had forgotten how. That thing that happened, like I said, with economic cycles being what they are, led to a big change in regulatory approach. And I think this is, again, one of those bits of complexity that I'm not sure I know exactly the way through this bit, or anybody does, frankly, but we need to find a way. And that's that when the regulator starts making everything about show why you did something, then you end up with an inevitability about decision-making aggregating to the boardroom, and the non-executives, in order to justify the decisions made by the executive, hire the big four consulting firms and some others to come along to say, could you please validate the decision-making?
Like the kind of firm that did the audit a few weeks before Silicon Valley Bank went down the toilet. And
just like that sort of situation. And there's something really self-serving about that that's causing, and I think that's a real difficulty for people. So again, I just sort of putting myself in the shoes of some people, and it doesn't make it beyond the realms of possibility.
There's something really, really challenging about that. And, I don't want to kind of get too esoteric here, but it does really go to the kind of nature of how particularly Western society has evolved over the last, 200 years or so. Hopefully that's not the Russians. How Western society has evolved really since the Enlightenment. So you're talking, 250 years or so. And this is towards ever increasing belief that you can analyze, conceptualize, grasp, put numbers on things, and that's the way to secure things. That's the way to ensure that you protect the future. So you see it in regulation. You see it, in all sorts of manifestations of rules and people checking the checkers of the checkers of the checkers. And what it does is it forces us down this kind of avenue that. There's this saying, George Box, who was a mathematician, said all models are wrong, but some models are useful. Yeah. The trouble is there's a propensity in Western society to believe that the model isn't just a model, it's the way things are. So, traditional economics was like that. It's like, well, we can't model that, so we'll leave that out of the equation. It's like, well, if you've left it out of the equation, it might be important, but we can't model it, so we can't include it in the equation. So then we only focus on the things that we can measure. And then you end up leaving out a whole bunch of things that are things that really matter that then don't get addressed. Yeah. And it's very, very hard to deal with this. And, cognitive science is trying to grapple with this because as they try and develop machine intelligence, what they're realizing is there's a lot of things where as human beings, we kind of have a sense of what to focus on, but it isn't programmed into us in the same way as you could program it into a computer. But when you ask somebody, well, why did you look at that? They'll go, well, it was obvious. So, well, what do you mean it was obvious? It's like, well, behind that obviousness is a whole bunch of experience and skills and having been in the situation before and developing an acuity and a sensitivity and a knowing what to focus on, not just going with what's salient and all of that. So we have this challenge that there's a real drive to try and nail everything down and put numbers on it, show you're working, tick all the boxes, show that you've done all those things. But that doesn't actually deliver the outcome that people are looking for who are driving things in that way. So there's a belief that the way to get things working well is to have them more systematized, more organized, more controlled, more measured. And yet actually it ends up producing side effects that nobody wants.
Yeah. No, I completely get that. And I think, again, one of the ways that I tend to think about that is that, we've lost sight of all of the stuff we do. I thought we've lost sight. I make it sound like everybody once agreed with me on this. I'm not suggesting that for a second, right? But it feels like we've lost some of the wisdom, perhaps, that we may once have held. Yeah. All business, all decisions are judgments, aren't they? And we pay people to make judgments. And I always think about everything we do here as an experiment, right? I don't know. And we're doing something innovative, right? But that's not the point. It doesn't matter what we were doing. If I was selling chocolates, right? All I can do is decide what type we're going to make, who we're going to try and sell them to, where we're going to place that, and all those sorts of things that you do. But every one of those is a little lever I pulled. Well,
you could invite some potential customers in to be part of experiments that you're doing things. Seriously.
Yeah,
it's like, yeah.
But they're all experiments, right?
Yeah.
And so they're all just judgments. And I think we're, what's incredible about the stuff that we see, and it makes you question some of the systems that we have in, the governance stuff that we use in particular. I think that we can look at an organisation that is successful and say that all that must have been right. Everything must have been right about that, and then we can all see very suddenly what was wrong with the ones that went wrong.
Yeah,
if that makes sense. So that there's a bad judgment in there, a bit of misfortune. And we then make it about the system. And I'm not sure that that's entirely right. That's the wrong application. And it's human beings trying to do the right stuff. And it ultimately all comes down to the fact what you're doing is you've got to create the conditions, right? I guess I'm long-winded way of saying I agree with, it's about conditions, isn't it? And accepting the uncertainty that comes with every market we operate in and the difficulties with that unique combination of ingredients that we're all served. Now, I started about 45 minutes ago. I asked you a question, which included the word leaders, which took us off.
I don't think it was 45 minutes. That was probably about 18 minutes ago.
All right. But what three things matter most right now? And now, we've had two side conversations subsequently. Would either of those things be in it? Or, are there three things that you think matter most out there right now?
I would say the three things that you've asked me the question, so the three things that I would say is recognise it's about leadership, not about leaders, and all that entails. So we had some side conversation about that. I would say recognise that the way in which leadership plays out is always about sense making sense of who we are, what the world is, how that's changing. So doing that well, doing decision making well. And by the way, if you do sense making well, decision making becomes much easier, because if people are involved in the sense making, then often the decisions just drop out of the sky almost. It's so obvious what we need to do. And then the action taking goes well because having been involved in the decision making because they were involved in the sense making, people know how to operate. And then if things change, they're quick to say, oh, hang on, we can see that one of the assumptions that we used when we were making sense of this to make the decisions, to take the actions, turns out not to be right. So we can quickly correct, and people are involved in self-correction. So recognising that that's always been the way leadership has done, sense-making, decision-making, action, but recognising now you have to do it much more quickly, you have to do it much more iteratively and dynamically, and you have to involve more people, because they're the people in the body of the organisation are always the ones who do the best sense making, because they're picking up weak signals from customers. They're in the same situation day in, day out with value creation and what's working and what's not working. So my three would be leadership, not leaders, recognising that the nature of the way we do sense making, decision making and action taking has to be different, more adaptive and quicker. And the third thing is recognising that the culture in your organisation, again, culture is always experienced by people as the way we do things around here, but the way we've tended to think about culture for the last 40 years is, it's our shared values. And actually it's not, it's the set of mindsets people have, because where do people have the awareness of the way we do things around here? Well, it's in their mindset. And their mindset is not just what they know on that kind of surface theoretical level, it's the deeper layers of what they do, what they see, and how they perceive themselves to be within the context in which they operate. The stuff about purpose and stuff that you were talking about earlier, for me, a lot of that comes down to if culture is the way we do things around here, then the we and the round here are often, it's quite an adaptive thing. So right now, there's you and me sitting here, so it's we two. And then we might be in a meeting with half a dozen people, or we might be on a drinking dialogue call with 20 or 30 people in the plenary, and then we're in a breakout with 4. So the we keeps changing. And the reason organisations are focused on purpose, and before that on mission and vision, was there's an attempt to try and get a corporate-wide set of we. Yeah. And very often what you really need is the dynamic interplay of lots of smaller senses of we, the functions, departments or whatever. I got to come back to the BBC. If you're in the BBC and you work in the news department, there could be you and a colleague. There could be you and the team that does the 6 o'clock news. And if you're the 6 o'clock news, then you're the best of the news teams, because News 24 is much further, and 1 o'clock news is a bit further down. News 20, rolling news is much lower down the pecking order. And so you're competing with each other. But you let something happen, like a member of the royal family dies, or there's a big disaster, and then the BBC comes together. So now it becomes we, the BBC. So recognising that nature of culture, that culture isn't just a one-size-fits-all, here's our 5 values, everybody better have them, otherwise, they're out the door. But understanding culture as an evolving thing, and why that can be a strength to your organisation, rather than trying to, getting away from the idea of cultural fit to an idea of cultural fitness, and fitness for a world that is increasingly uncertain and unpredictable.
So let's talk about some of those things, because you touched on this a couple of times.
So I'm just going to recap my 3 things. Leadership, not leaders, sense-making, decision-making and action-taking, and understanding what culture really is, as opposed to what we've been told it is.
Yeah, all right. And funny enough, so I just, I'm going to defend my purpose point, because I don't see that as being related to the values. I know that there is, I know that the vision, mission, vision, values type thing was often related, but I think there is, I still stand by them. We used to run an exercise, which was to try and get people to think in a longer horizon, where you'd say, rather than think about a poster on the wall, imagine you were etching something in a stone plinth above your door. Even this all sounds crazy now when you think about where we work, but you imagine that, and you just say, what do we want to be here for doing in 15
I'm
years.
seeing the matrix here, like temet nosce, know thyself.
Yeah, but I think that that's just getting people to think, having a rallying point at some longer point in the future. And I think I've always liked that sort of notion. It doesn't mean, but let's talk about culture.
Yeah.
Because actually the culture is something that you've talked to me in two ways about, and I wanted to sort of I wanted to explore with you in an interesting way. So firstly, one of the things I came across with your Substack was the 7S, your critique of, just the article I forget, culture is not
it's called The Toxic Myth of Culture as Shared Values.
There we go, perfect. The toxic myth.
Not being too sort of strong about it, but
the toxic myth.
The toxic myth
of culture as shared values. So talk to me about that, because and then so that's really about what it's not. But I wanted to just explore that with you. What's culture?
So my definition of culture is it's the system of mindsets that forms and informs people's awareness of the way we do things around here. So people experience the way we do things around here, the way they know, or the place that they have within themselves that dictates the way we do things around here is their mindset.
Yeah.
And their mindset is influenced by the attitudes and behaviours of others. Those attitudes and behaviours are influenced by their mindset. So you've got this system, right? It's a systemic relationship between mindsets and behaviours. And what you find in all organisations is there are usually a small number of people who are quite influential in the sense that they send off signals, clues and cues, some more explicit, some more tacit, under the radar kind of things, that people pick up on in order to infer the way we do things around here. And the reason that the shared values thing took hold was, as we were exploring earlier, when the Japanese miracle happened in the late 70s, early 80s, and they were eating everybody's breakfast, lunch and dinner. Obviously, the senior executives, typically in North America, turned to the consulting firms for help, and they hadn't got anything to help them with. So McKinsey, who were already on the back foot because Boston Consulting had changed the nature of the game in consulting. They'd gone from, consulting was always a bit like traditionally a profession, like law or accounting. You had your firm that you went to for advice, and they gave you that advice. And then, as I mentioned, Bruce Henderson, who had been at Arthur D. Little, left in 1963 to set up Boston Consulting because he believed you could be more focused in how you marketed consulting. So he came up with the idea of pamphleting senior executives with the ideas that he had generated and some of the colleagues at Boston Consulting. And that way clients started to see, these guys have got some really good ideas. And so they got a reputation for being smarter than McKinsey, which of course McKinsey didn't like at all. So with all this stuff around Japan coming up, they sent off a then unknown consultant called Tom Peters on a 5-year study tour to go to Japan and other places like Scandinavia, because there was an understanding that there was a more collectivist form of leadership and management going on there. So he did this 5-year study tour, and they came back, and there was a 2-day, he called it a seance. I don't think they were contacting dead spirits, but anyway, it's just a two
figure
days
of speech.
There was him, Bob Waterman, so they were both McKinsey consultants, Tony Athos, who was from Harvard, and Richard Pascal, who was sort of halfway between academia and McKinsey consultant. And the four of them came up with this 7S model. And the idea of the 7 S's was that there were 3 S's that McKinsey were already quite, strong at. So there was strategy, structure and systems. And as Tom Peters said in his analysis of the 7S models, the 7S model that, I think I can remember it probably verbatim, he said that McKinsey's traditional view was that anything that couldn't be solved with a scintillating new strategy would be solved by rearranging the boxes on the organisation chart. And I mean, that was as a McKinsey consultant. They tried to get him fired, actually, because he was so anti their traditional very mechanistic
Is that
machine,
right?
like way of doing it. But he was sort of stuck out in the San Francisco office, and it wasn't on the mainstream, so they kind of, he got away with things. But they came up with these three, and then they decided they needed some softer ones to deal with the aspects of culture. So they had what was the other three? You got structure, systems, and strategy. Then you had staff. There were two others. And anyway, there was the seventh one, which was shared values. Now, originally, it was superordinate goals, and this was something that Tony Athos brought in from social psychology, where the idea is superordinate goals are goals that, when people are working together, they're kind of goals that are a higher purpose outside of their own narrow interests.
Yep.
So it's like if you're working with another organisation, it's, how do we work together to achieve something together that is greater than the sum of the parts? But as Tom Peters tells the story, he said, that was seen as too complex for the average McKinsey consultant. So they just changed it like that to shared values. So the idea was that rather than it being something where you were looking out to the bigger picture as to what you could do in the world, it became looking inward to say, what do we think the values are that we want our people to follow? So culture became kind of like a normative behaviour control method. And what you could do is consultants could sit in a room with the clients and come up with a set of shared values, which they could then put on the wall. And the reason that it took off was because, of course, it gave the executives something concrete that they could do. It gave the consultants something they could do. But it left the senior executives feeling we're still making all the decisions, right? It reinforced this: senior executives are decision makers. And the toxic bit, the reason I used the word toxic in the title was because the problem is, once you've done that exercise, anybody who is inside the organisation and probably at a senior level who is influencing the culture in an adverse way that is not the way the organisation needs to behave, they'll say, well, we've already, the culture's okay, we've already done it, look, there it is, and they'll point to the list of 5 values on the wall. And if you want, the classic case, well, the 2 classic cases of organisations who did this and didn't get anywhere, Enron, whose values were respect, integrity, communication, and excellence. And their integrity was such that they managed to fiddle the books enough to destroy the whole company. And at the time was $65 billion write-off, the biggest write-off of any company in American history up to that point.
Yep.
And their CEO was an ex-McKinsey consultant, and they paid McKinsey $10 million a year to advise them on how to run the company. So there you've got somebody who should be able to do shared values if it works. And the second example I always use is McKinsey themselves, who one of their values, if you go to their website, is the highest ethical conduct. 3 years ago, they were fined $575 million for turbocharging opioid sales in America, contributing to tens of thousands of excess deaths through overprescription, because they told Purdue Pharmaceuticals how to turbocharge the sales of their addictive drugs, whilst at the same time they're working for the FDA, who provide the rules and regulations that pharmaceutical companies have to work to. And don't worry, because we have a firewall between the two teams, but under Senate investigation, they discover that there are 20 consultants working on the Purdue case who are also working for the FDA at the same time. So if the company that invented shared values as your culture can't make it work for themselves or their clients, that should tell you all you need to know.
Yeah, I agree. I even wrote it, and you remind me that I must go back and adjust this, but I wrote about dissent as a valuable trait in organizations, and quoted McKinsey, funnily enough, as one of those places where I suspect it's an apocryphal story, but where you have an obligation, you try and encourage people to that obligation to dissent, to have a different view. And I don't mean that. And Netflix have a similar one where they talk about basically courting different opinions and making sure that you're not just accepting acquiescence and that sort of stuff. But it is fascinating, isn't it, that the values of organisations that claim integrity, well, they don't work. We know that, right? But writing them down doesn't make them any more likely to occur when.
And the thing is that it's not just the fact that McKinsey got in first, and they wrote this piece that was published in Business Horizons in 1980 that launched the 7S model. And I mean, I only got into
old?
Yeah, I only got into this kind of consulting work in the late 80s. And I remember somebody introducing me to the 7S model, and I was like everybody else. I'm just like, I was come from McKinsey. They must have done tons of research. Yeah. It must have kind of, and then to discover actually what had really happened and where it had come from. So that's one side of why we really kind of hook, line and sinker have gone down the organisation values route. But the other thing is, values are super important on the individual level. It's like, as an individual, if you discover what your values are and you bring them more into your actions and interactions so they become virtues, so, character traits. Yeah. And Angela Duckworth, who's the professor of psychology at Pennsylvania University, who wrote the book Grit, makes that clear distinction between character traits as virtues. So it's when you enact something. So she gives the example, you can value kindness, but not be very kind.
Yes.
But you can't have the character trait of kindness unless you actually perform actions with kindness in the world. So it's this distinction between values and virtues. But when you do that as an individual, it has a massive effect on your well-being. You flourish, you feel more happy, fulfilled and contented because you are being more authentic, you're being more true to yourself. And so it's a very easy intellectual leap to go from, well, I know my personal values are super important to me as a person, therefore our shared values as an organisation must be super important. And then we get into the whole shared values exercise. Yeah. And yet, if you look at the maths, like the idea that you would have 5 values in your organisation and that everybody in the organisation would share those values. University of Zurich did some research where they came up with what they regarded as the 19 cardinal values of human beings all around the world. So if there are 19 values and you've got to select people who have the same 5, when you do the maths, you realise that for each person you recruit, you have to do 11,600 interviews, because only 1 in 11,600 people will share the same 5 out of 19 values. And Richard Clayton, who you mentioned in the context of Drinking Dialogues, he found a company in America that reckons they got a list that you can download of 500 values. Well, if you pick 5 out of 500, then you'd have to do more interviews than all the people who have ever lived in the history of the human species. There's 1 in 255 billion people would have the same 5 values. For? I don't know, for selling a list of 500 values, probably.
Just here's a shortcut. Selling a dictionary cheaper, that would
go through the 500 and pick. You must be able to pick 5. Pick 5 that you like out of 500. There must be some.
Find the 5-letter word that you want to. This is going to be called Swift.
But the problem is, it's become so deeply ingrained in the folklore of organisations. Is that, I mean, I'm working with clients now. As a firm I'm working with in Australia, they're like, we get this, we really understand what you're saying, but there's no way we can not have our values, because they're just they're in the plexiglass on the wall, and it's like they're people, I don't know, carry little cards around in their pockets anymore, but people used to, with the corporate values on.
Yeah, and it's really important. And there's what's really interesting about it, though, of course, and you're right with the cynicism is it's not a million miles from being. I don't agree that I don't believe that you can hire people that fit those values. But if you had 5 things that you genuinely meant, and then you aligned reward systems to those 5 behaviors becoming traits that our people shared, and accept that they don't have them when they arrive, because we all have different upbringings, right? We all have different educations, and we all have different environments we live, but that's, I'm still thinking about something you said right at the beginning, or way earlier in our conversation, about the fitness and consultants coming in and doing the work. The same process with culture is that it's never done, and values should never be done. It's not. We can't say that these are the things we value and then that's it, right? Go back to what we did yesterday. Yeah. It's the work you do all the time, right?
The thing is, if they're alive in the organisation, you don't necessarily need to write them down. And if you write them down, the people who don't follow them will look at the list and go, yeah, I do that, yeah, I do that, yeah, I do that, yeah, I do that, yeah, I do that. And so it's actually counterproductive to write them down.
I'm sure it is. No, but again, I try and, I think it's really hard for everybody, you know, and I think we have to tread this line, don't we? Where, well, if you're, you know, going into organizations, and again, this is the sort of other part of my finder mindset, and saying, well, you've done that, I wouldn't do that. If I were you, I wouldn't start from where you are, which is not a helpful statement. And so you just know that I think trying to help organizations do better at some of these things, it's a tricky thing, isn't it? It's a tricky thing. So so we were talking about culture. So we talked a little bit about what it's not, and the 7S model and how that's right. Now you talk about culture in a slightly different way, don't you? And you've touched on that. Is there more that I've heard you describe much more of what culture really is, and how organizations might think about it in a different way?
Yeah, I think probably one of the most useful things around the world of culture is to recognize that what culture is again, my former colleague Peter, who sadly passed away, motor neuron disease last year, he used to have this little phrase that culture is the secret everyone already knows. And what he meant was that when you join an organization or you move into a different function or a different role or a different department, how do you work out what's the way we do things around here? And what you do is you keep your eye on certain behaviors, you look at, maybe there's some values written down, and you kind of go, do they actually follow those? And if they don't follow them, well, who doesn't follow them, and who gets on and who gets penalized? And so you start to form a view of who matters, who are the people you have to stay on the right side of in order to get what you want and to avoid what you don't want. There's certain people that you realize actually they're quite influential. I have to, make sure I'm having the right impression on them. And then you work out what it is you think they want to see from you and what they want to not see from you. And then you behave in ways that produce what it is they want to see from you and avoid producing what it is they don't want to see from you. And so you actually work out, and again, Peter used to describe this as, think of it as the advice that you would give a close friend on how to survive and thrive in the organization. So it might be, there's a lot of talk around here about teamwork. So kind of look really a team person, but at the end of the day, you get rewarded based on your own personal performance metrics. So always hit your numbers, but look like you're being a team player. So you end up with people working out that the best way to behave around here is to be standing out as the best individual team player, which has a certain irony to it. And because we're very complex beings, and we're really good at picking up these mixed signals and optimizing and working out what the optimum way to behave is, given the different signals that we're picking up. And within a culture, people pick up signals through, a former colleague of mine did some research at MIT, then published in the mid-90s, 96. It was published in a book called Intentional Revolutions. Joan Lancourt and two of her colleagues produced this, and they identified 7, I tend to think of them as channels because I was at the BBC, and so you've got all the radio channels, right? And people pick up on a combination of them. But they have these 7 channels that people kind of tune into to pick up what's the way we behave around here. And once you kind of understand those 7 channels and you think about, well, what are the messages and the signals people are picking up down those 7 channels, you get to start to understand, oh, right, that's why we have the culture we have. And that's why you get misalignments, because you've got somebody. So one of the channels is persuasive communication. So you have somebody senior saying, we need to be much more team-based and blah, 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 blah. And team. We don't want individual stars. We want good teams that work together, play to their strengths in such a way that their weaknesses remain irrelevant and all that great stuff. But another one of the 7 channels is extrinsic reward. So if you get rewarded individually on your individual performance while the boss is saying, be team orientated, then you get exactly the behavior I was describing a few moments ago. Yep. So once you realize, it isn't just that there aren't just sort of the levers that organizations mostly pull are structural rearrangement, extrinsic rewards, and coercion. But those are only 3 of the channels. The other 4 are persuasive communication, participation, role modeling, and expectancy. And role modeling and expectancy are the most subtle of the 7. But they're also the ones that become most important when what you're trying to do is unlock leadership as the capacity of the community to shape its future, because they have the most subtle influence on people and they're the things that create the signals that let people feel it's okay to come up with crazy ideas, share half-baked ideas, and to kind of be willing to put forward a perspective even when they know it's only half-baked, because they know it won't get shot down in flames.
So what are those last two?
So role modelling.
Yeah, so I know what that is.
And expectancy. So the best way to understand expectancy is in relationship to role modelling. So role modelling is you behave in the ways that you want others to behave. Or people pick up on certain role models and they say, oh, they're the role models, so I will behave like them. So it's you see them doing it, so you pick up that that's the way to do things, and so you develop that ability.
So they sit together as...
But the expectancy is where, for example, if I think you're really capable and really competent, and you make a hash of something, I'm like, in my mind's eye, okay, maybe I didn't explain well enough, or perhaps there's some areas that David didn't understand about that. So it's not just to give you the benefit of the doubt. My perception of you is as a competent, capable person who can learn this stuff, and therefore I'm treating you with that care and that support and that guidance. If I think you're a bit of an idiot and you get something wrong, I'm like, oh well, that's all I wouldn't have expected anything different from him. And you pick up on that. There's subtle clues and cues that I give off that you pick up on to understand that I don't really feel you're capable. So if you doubt yourself a bit, and I'm sending this vibe to you that I doubt your capability, then you're probably going to fulfill my lower expectations of you. Whereas on the other hand, if I really have a lot of belief in you and you feel a little bit uncertain in yourself, you're going to go, well, I'm not entirely sure I can do this, but Geoff seems really confident and he seems like a sensible guy and he's been successful in his career. Maybe I can. And so you live up to the higher expectations that people have. And you see this in education. I mean, there's a classical story of a teacher who gets a new class in America, and at the end of the year, the headmistress says to her, how did the year go? And, she said, oh, very well. So how did the students turn out? She said, well, exactly as you predicted. What do you mean as you predicted? She said, well, all the A students did really well and the B students didn't do so well. And the headmistress says, what do you mean, the A students and the B students? She said, well, beginning of the year, you gave me a chart, and most of the paperwork, there was this chart with the kids' names, and there was some with A's by them and there's some with B's by them. And she said, really? Show me it. So she fetched the piece of paper and showed it, and she said, that's their locker numbers in the changing room. But the teacher believed that they were the A students, so she treated them as though they were capable. Yeah. And they did really well. And the B students, she was like, well, they're not really doing very well, but that's what we expect because they're the B students. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it's that kind of subtle, the expectation you have that somebody can do something or can't do something that influences them. And the way it differs from role modelling is you might be able to do something I can't do, but my belief in you helps you to develop the capacity to do that thing that you can do that I can't. Role modelling means I do something, you could do it, and you see it in me, and therefore you learn to do it too. So role modelling is...
Yeah, so we were talking about role modelling. I guess we'll conclude that point and then just pick up on one or two other things I want to talk about. So the difference then between expectancy, which is how you feel about my likelihood of success at a task, for example, how I feel you are likely to be at something. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's sometimes referred to as the Pygmalion effect. And Pygmalion was a Greek mythological figure. He was a sculptor, and he carved his ideal woman, and he fell so much in love with this statue that it came to life. So the idea being that the image that you have of someone else, you hold that image of them in your relationship with them, they're more likely to live up to that image. Now, if that image is negative, they'll live down to it. They're more likely to live down to it. If that image is positive, then they're more likely to live up to it. And often in organisations, we're pointing out what people are not doing to meet them. I mean, if you think about performance management systems or even HR models, it's kind of like, well, here's the job specification. So we're thinking of hiring you, and there's 7 things on our job spec, and 4 of them, you knock them out of the park. 2 of them you're okay-ish, and 1 of them you're pretty poor on. So what we're going to do is put you on a remedial program to do the 1 thing that you're really poor at. which you hate doing and have got no interest in, but then it makes you fit our job specification.
Yeah.
Why do that? Why not actually create an organisation around the strengths of the people that you've got? And then you'll find that because the 3 or 4 things that you're really good at, probably one of those you could be world class at, and we really need that to a high degree. And actually the things that you're not so good at and are really not interested in, perhaps there's somebody in the same department, or could be somebody in the same department who absolutely loves those things. Why would you not combine those 2 things? And Peter Drucker, who was like the god of management theory, I mean, he invented sort of management studies. He was on a call with the David Cooper Ryder, who was the guy who developed appreciative inquiry.
Yes, okay.
And this was so long ago that like having a satellite link across from the States was like a big thing, and they were on this link up thing. And so Drucker was probably in his 80s at this point, and Cooper Ryder asked him a simple question. He said, "You've got all this experience, Peter, like 60 odd years or whatever of researching management and publishing dozens of books. You know, if I asked you to sum up everything that you've learned in that period, how would you sum it up?" And Drucker said, "That's really easy." He said, "The secret of successful organisation is to play to our strengths in such a way that our weaknesses become irrelevant." So it's this idea of helping people flourish, but also helping them become aware of where they're not so strong, and then ensuring that they're working with people and colleagues who've got the complementary stuff that they need. And you know, again, to quote Richard Clayton, you know, he talks about you need spiky people, and that's if you have like a spider diagram of people's possible strengths. You need people who've got some real extreme peaks, but if you're going to have that, you're also going to recognise there's going to be some areas where they're not so strong. And he said the trouble is with most of the stuff that we have in organisation development and leadership development is what you end up with is well-rounded mediocrity, because you chop the bits off the spikiness and rein those in a bit, and then you try and encourage people to develop stuff in other areas that quite frankly they're never natural at and they don't really want to do, but you're only doing it because you've got a competency model that says you're supposed to have these. Why? Because some schmuck invented a competency model, and now you're trying to force fit people who are unique human beings with their own amazing talents and qualities, and as Drucker would say, you know, the inevitable weaknesses with which we are all abundantly endowed. You know, why not just work with that rather than try and fix it and make people into something that they're not? Yeah,
I like that. Good. Right. So then there was one other thing that I wanted to explore with you before we start to wrap up, and there's a couple of little closing questions I've got. But it's another part of the things that you do and you talk about that resonates closely with me and our work. And that's perspective. So you have a particular way of describing. I want to sort of, I could lead into it, I guess, by describing the way you do it, but I'd love to hear you talk about perspective. And the reason it matters so much to me, I think, is that one of the things that I see through my special window that we've talked about, one of the things that I see regularly is vast differences in the way people perceive the same environment. And one of the things that's interesting about that to me is often that's interpreted by organizations we work with. There's some people over there moaning about something, right? Or the moaners. Or there are, you know, there's always the funny people, whatever it is, or they, you know, whatever it is. But what you have is a bunch of people looking at the same organization and describing it differently. And I'm always intrigued by that, because my question is always, well, why do we see it so differently? Right?
Yeah.
Over to you.
Yeah. Well, let's link it to the 7 channels thing. So the 7 channels of culture. So the 7 of them, just to run through them again, this is the order in which they put them in the book. 3 and 4 I swap round, but this is my order, right? So persuasive communication. So this means that are people putting messages out into the organisation, often senior people, not always the most senior people, but the reason that it's persuasive communication is you have a degree of choice about whether you buy into the message or not. So you listen to it and you kind of, do I believe that? I'm going to, whatever. So if it persuades you, it's persuasive communication. Second one is participation. How much do you get involved in your own destiny within the organisation. So it's like how much autonomy, how much do you feel you're developing the skills and the competencies that you would like to, because you're getting the opportunity, and I would say to be involved in sense making, decision making, as well as action taking. That's participation. Role modelling and expectancy we talked about quite extensively. And then the three that organisations use all the time: structural rearrangement, which is new processes, reshuffling the boxes on the org chart, as Tom Peters said was McKinsey's speciality. Extrinsic rewards, so pay, bonuses, tying bonuses to what we think we want people to do, which is kind of like B.F. Skinner's behavioural psychology of rats in mazes. And, you know, the difference between a conjurer and a behavioural psychologist is a conjurer pulls rabbits out of hats and the behavioural psychologist pulls habits out of rats. And then coercion. And coercion is not just, you know, being really nasty. Coercion is, if you don't comply with this, you have to get out of the field in which the force is applied. So you might need to move to a different department, leave the company, whatever. So those 7 are all playing out all the time. Now, the thing is, different people tune into different combinations. And so the whole premise of the book that Joan Lancourt and colleagues wrote, Intentional Revolutions, was if you intend to have a revolution, if you intend to transform the culture, you better make sure that you're getting consistent signalling down those 7 channels, because in reality, some people will be picking up on different combinations of channels. And so the weighting that each individual gives to the channels and what they're picking up down those channels is different. Hence, they perceive the same workplace as very different. So that's one angle, and that kind of ties back to the 7 channels and why that's a really important framing for understanding culture. The other thing is, even with that, we all come at things from different angles. So as individuals, because of our personal stance, our makeup, our mindset, the way we approach the world. And as you asked me, I happened to position this thing ready for this moment. If you just ignore the logo, so I think you can probably see that is a circle, but also it's a triangle, and also it's a square. Now, if you get people in an organisation and they're having a conversation and everyone thinks they're on the same level and says, really, we have to be understanding what that fourth side of the square is, and somebody else is seeing the triangle. What do you mean the fourth side? It's like, well, it's a square, obviously, isn't it? No, it's not. It's a triangle. Well, if you kind of get caught in that perspective thing where you think, well, I'm seeing the truth, and if they're saying something different, then they're either mistaken, misinformed, bit daft, like mad or bad. They have an aptitude problem or an attitude problem. They're an idiot or an asshole. You're allowed to say asshole because Bob Sutton wrote a book, The No Asshole Rule. So this is now corporate speak that you're allowed. You can't say arsehole because that's the English version, but you can say asshole, which is the American version. So there's a tendency to go, well, you see a triangle and I see a square. We can't both be right. No, I am, so you must be wrong. So now what's all my attitude and intention towards you? Think about this in terms of expectancy. I'm already seeing you as wrong. So now I'm going to try and convince you that you're wrong, tell you where you're wrong, maybe listen to you a bit till I hear something that you say that I can use as a weapon against you in narrative warfare. We're not going to really co-create anything of value. But if you have this perspective that what we're actually seeing is a 2-dimensional view on a 3-dimensional reality that none of us sees in its whole, because we've always got an angle on it. We're always coming at it from one angle. We never see the whole picture. Then people start to have productive conversations. And I've been giving these out to clients for like 25 years or so. And I sometimes meet one I haven't seen for 15 years. I still have your thing on my desk. He said, we have punch-ups in the office. And I'm like, okay, hang on a second. You're seeing this. I'm seeing this. They're seeing this. What's the big picture that we're all trying to get hold of? And it just changes the nature of the conversation. It stops being who's right and who's wrong, and it becomes, well, look, there's some truth value in my perspective because I know it, because I've got that experience. But if I respect you as a person and as a colleague, there's got to be some truth value mixed in with all the obvious nonsense that you speak.
Absolutely.
And so then we've got some basis of actually engaging in a productive way. And to me, that's the essence of innovation in organizations. It's like bringing together your partial perspectives to say, well, what might be possible, with what we know and what we can see. I think this is, again, the same thing as Drucker was saying about playing to our strengths in such a way that our weaknesses become irrelevant. There's truth value in all of our perspectives, and there's also some other stuff mixed in. And we're never, ever going to get to the point where any of us, or even all of us, can see the whole picture. But one thing's absolutely certain, and that's none of us is as smart as all of us. And organisations talk about that as rhetoric, but the reality is often very different, because you do have people who get into positions either as decision makers or as experts or as budget holders or controllers of resources. And what they do if they get latched onto their 2D perspective is the people who say, I'm the decision maker, well, I have to make all the decisions, then their perspective has to override. The people who are the experts, they say, well, look, my expertise means that what I see is more valid than what you see. And they may genuinely have technical expertise, they may have market expertise, they may know a particular customer really, really well. But they may also use that to their advantage. They may say, well, look, my customer's worth 25% of our business, and they wouldn't go with this. I know they wouldn't. So, I reserve the right to trump everybody else's sense making. And then budget holders or people like in HR or finance, accounting, legal, often have the power to say no to things. And if you think about what life's like for them, it's kind of, well, somebody's asking me to do something that sounds approve something that sounds a bit risky. If I say no, then that risk never comes to fruition, and so I'm not in the firing line. If I say yes and something goes wrong, somebody more senior than me might ask the question, well, who approved this? So it's probably better for me to say no and come up with some plausible reason why I'm saying no. And all of these three behaviours, the decision makers who, I'm the decision maker, the experts who, my expertise trumps the sense making, and the people who restrict action taking because they can and it's less risky for them, they all impede the ability of the organisation to have the kind of fitness that they need, develop the fitness they need to cope with an increasingly uncertain and unpredictable world.
Yeah, I think that was brilliant that that's the last of the sort of big things I wanted to talk about, because I think when I think about our work, and just in that context, right? So that thing that you're describing, that interplay of roles in organisations has been going on forever. Mm. And in amongst all of that, we're not hearing lots of voices in those discussions. With the sense making is being trumped by position, by coercion, by persuasion, whatever it might be, or we're just talking people. One of the things I learned a long time ago is I tend to say, this comes from debating stuff at family lunches on Sundays when we were kids. So you just talk to make points quite forcefully. I don't mean aggressively, but you make them like baked beans for supper, as though it's the most important thing that I've got to say today, right? Mm-hmm. And people will go, oh, okay, right. Yeah. And that's not the decisions. You have to be very minded of it. Yeah. And I think that sort of hearing voices in organisations and making sure that we're hearing the sense made by everybody, and I'm just trying to keep that into your language because I think it's brilliant, is one of the biggest parts that we bring to this discussion. You can't solve all the problem. I mean, I recognise everything you said in your piece, but it is that ability to say and I think because in Harkn we've created some conditions and some settings, some context in which people can share their sense making in a better, safer way. That's really powerful, and it just needs we need for all the reasons we need those people who will use position to stop that sense making from being utilised in the right way.
Yeah, I mean, what I like about what I understand of what you're doing with Harkn is, and I cards on the table, I'm normally very sceptical about IT stuff to do with people and culture, because so often it's used to reinforce the distancing of senior executives from the people in the body of the organisation. Like, give me a dashboard so I know how to, drop the nuclear bomb on that person and send a big bag of goodies to that person. Yep. And it perpetuates this kind of distancing of the decision-making, which tends to get done at the top, from the action-taking and the sense-making, which tend to get done in the body of the organisation. What I really like about what you're doing that's very different is you're picking up signals that there are issues that ought to be brought to conversation and bringing the conversation to the people who've raised the issues. So that what you're doing is you're creating the conditions for people to learn more,
Yep.
about the different perspectives each others have. And, for me, you use the word debate, and there's a lot of debate in organisation. There's a lot of discussion in organisation. I think it's quite useful to look at those two words and a third word, which is dialogue, which are all forms of potentially conversation. But debate literally comes from the French débattre, which means to beat down. So you're beating, somebody else wants spaghetti hoops and you want baked beans for tea. So you beat down their argument. Discussion, the cushion piece comes from the same root as percussion and concussion. So basically, this is like you're smashing their argument to pieces.
Yeah.
So debate is beat the other opponent down. Discussion is smash their argument to pieces. But dialogue is dia is a cross, and the logos is the deeper meaning that is seeking to emerge. So the idea of dialogue is people are in a conversation where what they're trying to do is to tease out something that is bigger than the perspectives that they brought into the conversation. So it's actually a generative form of conversation. And I see what you're trying to do with Harkn as being something that uses technology to, in a very simple way, to support the possibility of those conversations. And that's why I've come all the way across the country to be here to have this conversation today.
Thank you for that. And without blowing too much smoke in your direction, we use the word dialogue in here to describe what we do, and part of for the very reason that you educated me on the difference between the words some months ago, and because it makes such a difference. In fact, we even changed a feature recently because we saw that it was anti-dialogue.
Right.
So what it was doing is encouraging people to close conversation and dialogue faster, rather than preventing truth to come out. Right. And that's it's a really, really powerful way for us to think about it, and I'm glad you shared that as well. Now, look, we've been going for a fair time now. It's a terrific conversation. I think we could probably do several more of these, but I got two other questions for you. Yeah. Two and a bit questions. There's always one more, but you talked about Tom Peters. How would so everybody will recognise that name? How would they know Tom Peters?
Well, they'd probably have heard of his book, In Search of Excellence, which he wrote with Bob Waterman, who was another one of the gang of four that infamously met in that hotel room in San Francisco for their seance. And he really, what he did was he was like the first rock star business guru, if you like. I use the term guru in the Peter Drucker sense. Peter Drucker always resisted being called a guru. He said that the reason people call him a guru is it's easier to spell than charlatan.
That's a good
But,
sentence.
you could become a rock star business presenter and, jump around on stage. Tom Peters has got his whole shtick where he's like super energetic and jumping around and stuff. Made a load of money for doing it and, inspired a whole generation of wannabe Tom Peterses as well.
Brilliant.
It's actually Tom Peters with an exclamation mark at the end, of course. So that's his.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Didn't know that.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah. So the last proper question from me for just a little bit. If you had, it's a slightly playful one, I guess, but if you had the magic wand.
I do. You might have even seen it.
I
have a Harry Potter wand that I
forgot
got
this.
from the Warner Brothers tour.
Yes.
And I paid 26 quid for it, which is probably about $35 for American audiences. And I thought, God, that's a lot of money to pay for this little bit of wood in it. But the number of times on a Zoom call, the topic of something like this has come up and I've been able to pick it up and put it in front of the camera, Harry Potter wand. It's paid for itself multiple times over.
I feel like
I do
my-
have my
my
Harry
question,
Potter wand.
which-
I didn't bring it with me, unfortunately.
Thankfully.
I only brought this with me because this works more effectively.
Yeah, quite. Well, I think that the fact that this is a bit of a cliched question is probably been evidence enough. But I think, so if you had the magic wand, and we've covered lots and lots of ground today, but what one thing, it doesn't have to be something we've already talked about, what one thing would you change about the way things happen at work today?
Yeah,
Let's put it that way.
Well, it's interesting because what's just popped into my mind links back to that thing I mentioned about Drucker and his satellite conversation with David Cooper-Ryder, and he summarised everything that he'd learned in 60 years of management, play to our strengths in such a way that our weaknesses become irrelevant. It made me think, actually, when I heard that, what would be my equivalent? So I've thought about that over the years, and I've only been doing it for 35 years, so I'm nowhere near where the amount of time Drucker spent. But my equivalent would be, that the secret of success in this kind of work is if you can maintain the perception that the other person that you're dealing with is competent and well-intentioned, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, then you kind of have the capacity to role model and have the expectancy that can bring to life some of the magic that we need in our organisations. So I think that's how I would answer your question about.
I'm not sure how I feel about that response, but you've done a terrific job of that today. Thank you very much indeed. I certainly have felt as though you've treated me with a degree of competency and all those and capability. Well, listen,
well, it's because I believe it's there, David. I mean, genuinely.
Yeah, thank you.
I do.
What I would ask last from you, if I may, right? So this has been incredibly enlightening and educational conversation for me, as they always are. I follow your Substack, right? And we're going to put some stuff in show notes for this. But where can people find out more about the sort of work you do, find out more about your way of thinking? Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's 3 channels. I would start with the Substack thing because it's the thing that I put most effort into. And I publish every week. Yep. And it's fairly, usually fairly in depth, some longer than others. And it's the most recent thinking that goes into that. I need to update my website. My website still very much has me positioned as a consultant, and I've been very slow to pick up on talking about signals in culture change and stuff. I've been very slow to pick up on the signals myself about what I think I'm sort of, sounds a bit grandiose, I guess, but being called upon to do in terms of my own practice, which is less of the hands-on consulting in organisations and more of the I'll be a bit grandiose here, bringing on the next generation. So it's like education of change agents, helping people who are doing culture change and coaching and development of people in organisations, whether they're in management positions or not, to how to cultivate the kind of mindset that enables them to bring out the best in others and to be able to see others as competent and well-intentioned despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. It requires some skills and some muscles to build up. So I'm working on that. My website hasn't quite caught up with that. So my website's geoffmarlow.com, as you can probably see.
Flashing at the camera again.
If I hold it up to the camera, that's the logo.
Terrific.
Nicely laser engraved by a little firm not very far from here. And then my LinkedIn profile, which, I mean, if you put in Geoff Marlow, you should find me.
We'll find you there. And the Substack, for people who, I know that you can Google Geoff Marlow Substack and you'll get your...
Yeah, well, if you go to my website and you go to resources page, so geoffmarlow.com/resources, there's 3 things on there. There's there's a download, a 22-page document that I wrote about 3 years ago called The 5 Fatal Habits, which is why organisations have not been able to create innovation, agility and adaptiveness. So it's like they get focused on the one best way, the all or nothing, leadership that creates followers, wasting people's strengths and hired help that hinders. Big consulting, right?
Oh yeah, no, I got the last hint.
That's the 5 fatal habits. You can download that. There's a link to a videos page that has, I think, 8 videos on total of 45 minutes, which there's one that sort of describes how I got into this, and then there's a whole bunch of stuff around this 2D, 3D mindset and how you avoid fiefdoms, factions and silos, helping people get out of the seeing being trap and those kind of things that we've talked about today. And then the third link is to the Substack channel. Yeah. But on Substack, I think it's geoffmarlow.substack.com. So relatively easy to find. And normally what I do is for people who subscribe to the Substack channel, they get the weekly missive on a Sunday. Usually goes out at 7 a.m. UK time on a Sunday. And then I leave it not quite 24 hours, so usually around 6 a.m. on the Monday. I then post to LinkedIn the article that went out to subscribers on the Sunday. So they get kind of a 24-hour window of exclusivity.
And it is it genuinely is worthwhile. I mean, we've touched on a number of things that you've written today because I read them. I think it's a great resource for anybody doing that. And you're also doing one of our hot topics coming up soon, aren't you? That's in a month or so's time, am I right?
It would be good if one of us had the actual date in our head, wouldn't it? But I'm not,
But we'll put that in the notes.
Anyway, somebody may be watching this particular interview long after.
This is true, but that's about what is culture. So we're going to be a sort of group. You're going to be leading a conversation in a group about what's culture and bringing other perspectives.
I'm going to be talking to your boss about it in a week or so's time. That's Alison.
Fantastic. Good. All right. Listen, I just thank you once again. This is the first episode we've done of this. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I've really enjoyed doing it. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for inviting me, David. I feel very honoured to be the first person in the Jean-Luc Picard hot seat.
In the hot seat. Yeah, well done. All right. Thank you very much.